Welcome to this course on full-stack web development using React.js for front-end, .NET Core API for back-end and Microsoft SQL Server for the database. You will learn how to add navigation menu with routing in React, display data in Bootstrap Table, add modal pop-up window with drop-downs and date pickers. Also learn how to upload photo and store it in the backend server. Let's install SQL Server, which is needed to create databases and objects needed to store our app data. Just type install SQL Server and open the official download link. Download the developer version, which is free to download and use. Run the installable file. Choose Custom Install. Click on Installation and New SQL Server Standalone Installation. Let's choose Database Engine only for now and proceed with defaults. Choose Mixed Mode. Set the desired password. Also add the current user and make sure that the user is also admin. Now let's click on Install. Now let's install the SQL Server Management Studio, which is nothing but the user interface to work with databases. Just keep the defaults and install it. Now let's open SQL Management Studio and check if everything is fine. To open a local database, just type dot in the server name and click on Connect. We can see some default system databases. Let's write a simple select query on one of the existing tables. We have now successfully installed SQL Server and Management Studio. Now let's install Visual Studio, which we will be using to create the API project. Just type download Visual Studio and follow the official website. Let's download the community version, which is free to install. Run the installer file. We need ASP.NET Web Development, .NET Desktop Development. Let's also choose .NET Core Development. We have now installed Visual Studio. Now let's install Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a popular lightweight open-source code editor developed by Microsoft. Just type install Visual Studio Code and follow the official website. Download and install it with default settings. We have successfully installed Visual Studio Code. Now let's install Postman, which will be used to test the API methods. Just type install Postman and go to official link. Download and install it with default settings. You don't have to create an account. Just click on Skip. We have now successfully installed Postman. Now let's install Node.js, which we will be using to create and run the Angular project. Just type install Node.js and go to official link. Download and install it with default settings. You can open Node.js command prompt to check the version and verify the installation. We have now successfully installed Node.js. Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to create the database and the tables required for our application. Let's first open up SQL Server Management Studio. Let's connect to local database. To do that, just type dot in the server name and click on Connect. We see that currently we don't have any user-created databases. Let's start creating the database and tables needed for our app. Just click on New Query to open up a query editor. To create a database, just type create space database space the database name. In our case, the name of our database is EmployeeDB. Once the query is written, just select it and click on Execute button. The database is now created. We can verify it by refreshing the databases. Now let's start creating the tables required for our app. Our app has mainly two screens, a department screen and an employee screen. So we need to create two tables. Let's start with department table. The table will an integer ID column with identity 1, 1, which basically means we don't have to pass values to this column. It will start with value 1 and increments it each time a new record is inserted. We will also add a column which stores department name. Let's execute this query. Let's write a select query on this table. We see that we don't have any records in this table yet. Let's insert one by writing an insert statement. We don't have to pass the value for department ID since it will be inserted automatically. After executing select query, we can see that a row is now available with ID equal to 1. Now let's add another department. We can see that the ID of new department is 2. Now let's start creating the employee table. We need employee ID column. Employee name column. The department to which the employee belongs to. The date of joining whose data type is a date. And finally, we will also store the uploaded profile photo name. The actual photo will be stored in the API app server. Let's write an insert query. And a select query. We have now successfully created the database and the required tables to build our application. Let's start creating the .NET Core Web API project. Open Visual Studio. Click on Create New Project. Let's choose ASP.NET Core Web Application. Let's rename it. Choose the preferred folder to save the project. Choose API. We don't need HTTPS configuration for now. Now let's take a look at some of the important project files. All the dependencies or the packages needed for our project can be found in the Dependencies folder. Launch Settings JSON file contains details of how the project should be started. Controllers folder is where we write all our API endpoint methods. We will create separate controller files here as per requirement. We generally keep our configuration values such as database details in appsettings.json. The program.cs contains the main program, which is the entry point of our project. Also, it creates web host, which basically helps the app to listen to HTTP requests. The startup class configures all the services needed for our app. Services are basically reusable components that can be used across our app using dependency injection. It also contains the configure method, which creates our app's request processing pipeline. We need to make a couple of changes in startup class. One is to enable the CORS. By default, all web API projects come with a security which blocks requests coming from different domains. We are basically writing instructions now to disable that security and allow the requests to be served. We are also making one more change to the serializer class to keep the JSON serializer as our default. We might need to install a NuGet package to do this. Let's import the namespace. Now let's simply run our project and check if everything works fine. We see that the project works as expected and we are getting JSON result from one of the sample method. Now let's create the models needed for our app. Let's create a folder. Add a class file. Let's name it department.cs. Now let's add properties. Since department table has 2 columns, we will add 2 properties. Similarly, let's create the employee model. Now let's add our database connection in app settings file. Now let's add a controller to add API methods for department table. To access the configuration from app settings file, we need to make use of the dependency injection. Now let's add an API method to get all department details. I am writing raw queries to keep the tutorial simple. Please avoid following the same. You can use stored procedures with parameters or maybe even entity framework to connect to database. To work with database, we need to install a NuGet package called system.data.sql client. Let's define a variable to store the database connection string. Using the SQL connection and the SQL command, we will execute our query and fill the results into a data table. And then return the data table as JSON result. Let's test this method using Postman. The get method seems to be working. Now let's add the post method to insert data. We are writing an insert query to insert data. The post method seems to be working. Now let's add put method to update data. We will be using update query for this. Let's test the put method and update one of the department names. The put method works fine as expected. Let's finally implement the delete method. The delete API method will receive the ID of department as input. Since we are sending the ID in the URL, we need to add it in the root parameter. The delete method also works as expected. Let's add the API methods for employee screen. We can just reuse the methods written in department controller and make changes to it. Let's now test all our employee API methods. Let's now write an API to store the uploaded photos. Let's create a folder to store photos. To be able to use this folder in our app, we need to add some instructions in Startup class. Now let's create the API method. I am giving a custom root name for this method. We will simply extract the first file which is attached in the request body. We need to again use dependency injection to get the application path to folder. Let's save this file in our Photos folder. Once saved, we will simply return the file name. If there is any exception, we will simply return the default anonymous photo file name. We may also need a method to get all department names in the drop-down menu. Let's finish writing that as well. Let's now start creating the front-end part using React.js. Open up command prompt in the folder that you would like to create the project. Type npx create react app space the name of the app. Once command is executed, it creates a folder with the given project name. Let's see the contents using Visual Studio Code. The package.json file contains details of all the packages being used by this project. The node module folders is where all the packages are installed. Index.html file is the final file that gets rendered. We see that it only has one div tag with ID root. Let's see where this ID is being used. If we open index.js file, we see that the contents of app component is being injected into the div with ID root. Now let's see what are the contents of app component. Let's just run the project and check how it looks. Just type the command npm start. Let's delete all the contents of app component and just add an h3 tag. We see the h3 tag text, but the styling is not reflecting. This is because we have not installed React Bootstrap. Let's install it. Just copy and run the install command. Also, we need to copy the stylesheet link reference and paste it in index.html. Looks like the installation failed. Let's try again. It's now successfully installed. Let's check if it works. We see that the styling works as expected now. Now let's create the basic landing pages and navigation component. Create a new file and let name it home.js. We need to import couple of modules to create a React component. We are creating a class which returns the HTML view. Let's write a simple div tag with a simple text. Similarly, let's create a department component. and also employee component. Let's also create a navigation component and add the navigation menu. We will have 3 menus in navigation bar. One for home, one for department, and one for employee component. Now let's add our navigation component and other landing pages in the root component. We need to import all those components here. We need to import couple of modules from React Router DOM to configure the routing settings. Let's add the navigation menu. We need to define the routing configurations inside the switch tag. Looks like we need to install the module React Router DOM. Let's install it. We see that the navigation menu now works as expected. Now let's add our API URL. Create a file with name.env. Let's store the API URL with a variable name. Let's also store the photos URL. Also add the file name in gitignore. Let's add a constructor to our component. We need to write super props so that the component's constructor may get called. We can define our variables inside the state of this component. We are creating a variable to store department table data. Let's write a function to refresh departments array. We are writing fetch method to get data from the department API. Once the data is available, we update the departments array using setState method. We need to call the refresh method on a lifecycle method called as component didMount. We will also refresh the array on component didUpdate lifecycle method as well. Now let's add the Bootstrap table to display all departments. We display department ID and department name columns. Also one more column for edit and delete options. We now see department data in Bootstrap Table. Now let's create a screen to add department. This screen will be a modal pop-up window. Now let's add form with text box for department name. Let's add a button to save the department. The footer will have a close button to close the modal window. We will define the onHide function in department landing page. Let's define the handle submit method to save the department name using API. The body will have department name in JSON format. Once saved, we will display the message in alert box. If failed, we will display failed message in alert box. Now let's make changes in department landing screen to show or hide the modal pop-up window. Let's define a variable to show or hide the modal. Now let's add button toolbar for showing add department modal window. We need to also bind the handle submit function in the constructor. Now let's add new department. We see that we are now able to add new department. Let's complete edit department screen. Let's copy the contents of add department screen and make changes to it. The API will be put instead of post. We need to send the department ID for update. Let's add one disabled form to display department ID. Also we need to send the value from first screen and bind it using default value attribute. Let's add one variable to display or hide edit modal window. Let's add edit button. And pass the department ID and department name to the modal window. We see that the update method works as expected. Let's finally add delete method as well. Delete department will be a function which calls the delete API with the department ID. We will ask for confirmation before delete. We see that delete method also works as expected. Now let's complete the employee screens. We need to change API from department to employee. We may need additional variables for department, photo file name and date of joining. We see that landing screen for employee details is working fine as expected. Now let's complete the Add New Employee screen. We need to declare departments array to show values in drop-down. We may need some variables to store profile picture details and photo paths. Let's populate the drop-down array value in component did mount lifecycle method. Let's add a method to save the uploaded photo. We make use of form data and append the uploaded file to it. Then send this photo to the Save File API method. Once successful, we update the image source. The department field will be a drop-down. We will be mapping the department names using the array. The date of joining will be a date picker. We may also need to display the uploaded profile picture. And also a button to upload new photo, which will call the Save File API. Also, we need to bind the upload method in constructor. Let's try adding a new employee. We see that Add New Employee works as expected. Let's now complete the Edit Employee screen. Let's change the post method to put. Let's display read-only employee ID. We need to pass the default values from employee landing screen. We see that update works as expected. With this we have completed all the basic functionalities of our employee management app.